The summer of 1944 carried with it the suffocating heat of the Pacific and the weight of a war that seemed endless. On the island of Saipan, the ground trembled with artillery fire, and the air was thick with the stench of smoke and fear. Japanese soldiers who had sworn to fight until their last breath were forced to face a reality they had never imagined: capture. For them, surrender was worse than death, a stain on their families and their emperor. Among them was Hiroshi Takeda, a 23-year-old infantryman from Osaka. His hands were calloused from labor, his uniform tattered, and his spirit torn between the teachings of honor he had grown up with and the desperate instinct to survive. He remembered his mother's words before he left: "Bring pride to our family." Those words had guided him through the chaos of battle, but now, as American soldiers shouted orders and rounded up the remnants of his unit, Hiroshi felt the crushing weight of shame. Before we continue Hiroshi's journey, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because this story is not just about survival, but about discovering the strength hidden in the darkest places of history. The prisoners were marched along dusty paths under the relentless sun, guarded closely by armed Americans and Filipino auxiliaries. Each step stirred up clouds of dirt that clung to sweat-soaked skin. Some soldiers stumbled, too weak from wounds or exhaustion to continue. Hiroshi pressed forward, his throat parched, his eyes scanning the horizon for a glimpse of hope. But all he saw was barbed wire fences, trucks, and the wary faces of men who considered him the enemy. For Hiroshi, fear was not only of death, it was of the unknown. He had been told since his youth that American soldiers were brutal, that prisoners would be tortured, humiliated, or executed. Every glance from a guard felt like the prelude to his last moment. He kept his head low, whispering prayers that his family would never learn of his disgrace. The captured men moved in silence, broken only by coughs and the dragging of boots. Beside Hiroshi, an older soldier with streaks of gray in his hair muttered, "We are ghosts already." His name was Kenji Sato, once a schoolteacher in Nagano, now reduced to another face in the defeated column. Hiroshi didn't answer, but their eyes met briefly, sharing an unspoken acknowledgement of despair. Behind them, a younger recruit stumbled, his voice trembling with defiance. "They cannot keep us like animals. We will find a way to fight again." His name was Masaru Ishikawa, and even in chains, his spirit burned with anger. Hiroshi admired his fire, but feared it would only bring more suffering. As the march continued, Hiroshi's mind drifted to Osaka, to the smell of his mother's cooking and the laughter of his younger sister. The memory felt distant, almost unreal, as though it belonged to another life. He wondered if he would ever see his homeland again, or if his days would end nameless in a foreign land. The group eventually reached a makeshift holding area surrounded by barbed wire. Tents sagged in the heat, and armed guards paced methodically. The captured men were ordered to sit on the ground, their weapons long since confiscated, their futures hanging in the balance. Hiroshi lowered himself slowly, every muscle aching, his stomach tightening with hunger. In that moment, sitting in the dirt among broken men, Hiroshi felt something shift deep inside him. He had not been killed. He had not been beaten. He was still breathing. Shame weighed heavily, but beneath it flickered a stubborn spark: survival. He did not yet know what lay ahead in the prison camps of the Pacific, nor how he would endure the trials to come. But for the first time since his capture, he allowed the thought to take root. Perhaps this was not the end. Perhaps life could still be wrestled from the hands of fate. And so Hiroshi's story began, not as a soldier wielding a rifle, but as a prisoner confronting the uncertain road of captivity, where honor, hope, and humanity would be tested in ways he had never imagined. The first night after capture settled like a suffocating blanket over Hiroshi Takeda. He lay on the hard ground among dozens of fellow prisoners, his body aching from the march, his stomach gnawed by hunger. Around him, whispers carried fragments of fear and shame, men speaking in hushed tones as though their voices might summon more misfortune. The air was heavy with sweat and despair, and the faint cries of wounded men lingered in the distance. Hiroshi pressed his face against his arm, trying to block out the sounds. He wanted to sleep, but his mind refused to quiet. He thought of his father, a stern man who had taught him that surrender was a disgrace worse than death. What would he say now? The thought pierced him more deeply than any wound. Nearby, Kenji Sato sat upright, his back against a wooden post, eyes scanning the camp with a calmness that unsettled Hiroshi. "Do not let the shame consume you," Kenji said softly, as if sensing Hiroshi's thoughts. "We are still alive. That means something." Hiroshi turned his head toward him, voice low and sharp. "Alive for what? To rot in this place?" To face dishonor. Kenji's lips pressed into a thin line. "Honor will not keep your stomach full. Honor will not help you see another sunrise. If we cling only to pride, we are already dead." Hiroshi had no answer. His chest tightened, torn between defiance and the sting of truth in Kenji's words. The following day brought the humiliation of roll call. Prisoners were lined up, ordered to stand straight as guards barked instructions in English. Most understood nothing, but the gestures were unmistakable. A soldier shoved Hiroshi back into line when he faltered, the butt of a rifle striking his ribs. He bit his lip, refusing to cry out. The heat grew unbearable as the men were marched again, this time toward what appeared to be a more permanent enclosure. Dust clung to their legs, and sweat trickled down into their eyes. One man collapsed mid-step, his body trembling with exhaustion. Masaru Ishikawa, the fiery recruit, stepped forward. "Get up," he hissed, grabbing the fallen man by the arm. "Do not show weakness." His face burned with anger, not at the prisoner but at the sight of submission itself. The guards shouted, pulling Masaru back with force. Hiroshi watched the scene unfold, torn between admiration for Masaru's spirit and dread at what such defiance might cost them all. The fallen soldier was eventually dragged along, half-conscious, a reminder that strength was dwindling among them. That night, the prisoners were given rations, if they could be called that. A ladle of watery soup, a handful of rice. Hiroshi stared at the food in his tin cup, the steam carrying a smell that reminded him faintly of home. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, though it did little to calm his hunger. Around him, men ate in silence, some clutching their food as though it might be stolen at any moment. Masaru's voice broke the quiet. "We are not beaten. Do not let them strip us of who we are." His eyes flashed in the dim light, daring anyone to challenge him. Kenji responded with steady patience. "We must endure. Strength does not always mean resistance. Sometimes it means waiting." The tension between the two men hung in the air, reflecting the divide within every prisoner. Resist or survive. Hiroshi felt the weight of that choice pressing heavier than the chains around his wrists. He wanted to believe in Masaru's fire, yet something in Kenji's calm endurance rang truer. As the night deepened, Hiroshi lay awake again, listening to the sound of men coughing, whispering, and shifting in restless sleep. He stared at the stars beyond the barbed wire, distant and unreachable, yet steady in their light. For the first time, he wondered not just if he would survive, but what kind of man he would be if he did. The march, the hunger, the shame, all of it carved into him a truth he could no longer escape. The war had taken more than battles and territory. It had taken his certainty, leaving him to carry the crushing weight of defeat into an unknown tomorrow. The sun beat down mercilessly as Hiroshi and the others were marched toward their new destination. Each step seemed heavier than the last, as though the very earth resisted their passage. Dust rose with every shuffle of weary feet, coating throats already raw from thirst. Hiroshi's eyes burned, but he forced himself to look ahead, where the outline of fences and guard towers grew sharper. The reality of captivity was no longer an abstract fear. It stood before him, wrapped in barbed wire. As they entered through the gates, the first thing Hiroshi noticed was the smell. It was a mixture of sweat, smoke, and decay, lingering in the air like a curse. Rows of tents sagged under the weight of the heat, and makeshift latrines filled the space with a stench that turned his stomach. Guards patrolled with rifles slung over their shoulders, eyes watchful, expressions hard. The camp was not a place of rest, but of control. The prisoners were ordered to halt. Shouts in English rang out, followed by gestures to line up. Hiroshi obeyed, his body stiff with tension. He glanced sideways and caught sight of Kenji, whose face remained calm, almost unreadable, as though he had seen this before. In contrast, Masaru stood rigid, his jaw tight, eyes darting between the guards with barely contained fury. One of the American soldiers moved down the line, checking each prisoner. He stopped in front of Hiroshi, staring at him for a long moment. Hiroshi lowered his gaze, bracing for a blow. Instead, the soldier simply muttered something under his breath and moved on. Hiroshi exhaled slowly, his body trembling with the release of fear. Later, the men were herded toward a section of the camp where space had been cleared for them. They were told to sit, to wait, to accept their place in silence. Hiroshi lowered himself to the ground, his muscles sore from the march. Around him, conversations began in low tones, fragments of worry and speculation filling the hot air. Masaru's voice cut through. "We cannot stay like this. If we wait, we will rot. We must act." His words carried a sharp edge, igniting murmurs among the prisoners. Kenji replied firmly, his tone steady. "Act recklessly and you doom us all. We are surrounded, outnumbered, unarmed. The only path now is to endure." Masaru's glare was fierce. "Endure? You call this endurance? This is humiliation." The argument drew the attention of nearby guards, who shouted and motioned for silence. Hiroshi's heart raced as he watched the tension mount. He feared that Masaru's fire, though noble in spirit, would bring punishment upon them all. When the voices quieted, Hiroshi's gaze drifted across the camp. He saw men already broken, their shoulders slumped, their eyes hollow. Others sat with rigid pride, refusing to let defeat show in their posture. The camp seemed to reflect the inner battle of every prisoner, the struggle between dignity and survival. As night approached, the prisoners were given thin blankets and directed to their assigned space. Hiroshi lay on the hard ground, staring up at the fading sky. The air was thick with insects, buzzing endlessly, and every sound beyond the fences reminded him that they were caged. His stomach growled, but no more food came. Kenji settled nearby, his voice quiet but resolute. "Remember, Takeda, this is only the beginning. How you choose to face it will decide whether you remain a man or lose yourself." Hiroshi absorbed the words, their weight pressing against his weary thoughts. He closed his eyes, but sleep would not come easily. Instead, questions haunted him. How long would they be held here? Would they survive? And perhaps the most painful of all, would he ever see his family again? In the stillness of that first night within the camp, Hiroshi realized the battle was no longer fought with rifles or bayonets. It was fought within the confines of his mind and spirit, where hope and despair clashed in silence. The days in the camp began to blur together, each one marked by the same unrelenting routine. At dawn, guards stormed through the rows, barking orders that needed no translation. Prisoners were forced to stand in formation, their bodies stiff from the cold night on the ground. Hiroshi's back ached constantly, and hunger gnawed at him from within, but the rules of survival were already becoming clear. Obey quickly, move steadily, avoid drawing attention. Food was meager: thin soup, rice that often carried stones or insects, and water that tasted of rust. Hiroshi learned to eat slowly, to trick his stomach into feeling fuller than it was. He watched others gulp down their rations, only to be left restless and aching with hunger. Kenji's words echoed in his mind: endure. Work details became another part of life. Some prisoners were assigned to carry lumber, others to dig trenches or repair fences. Hiroshi found himself pushing carts of stones under the watch of guards who never looked away. Sweat drenched his body, the heat pressing down like a hand that sought to crush him. Yet in those moments of toil he began to understand something new. Work, though exhausting, kept him moving, breathing, and living. During one grueling afternoon, Hiroshi stumbled while lifting a heavy plank. A guard raised his rifle butt, ready to strike, but Kenji stepped forward, steadying the load with quiet strength. The guard's eyes narrowed, then he waved them on. As they walked, Hiroshi whispered, "Why risk yourself for me?" Kenji's reply was calm. Because if we do not help each other, none of us will leave this place alive. The words settled into Hiroshi's heart, heavier than the plank he carried. He had been taught to fight for emperor and nation, but here, survival was tied to the man beside him, not the distant figure on a throne. Masaru, however, refused to accept the routine. His anger smoldered with every passing day. One evening, when the prisoners gathered in whispers, he muttered, "This is not living. They want us to forget who we are. I would rather die fighting than waste away in chains." Hiroshi didn't answer immediately. The fire in Masaru's eyes was undeniable, but so was the danger. "If you fall now," Hiroshi said finally, "your death will mean nothing. If you endure, maybe one day it will." Masaru spat into the dirt, shaking his head. "You sound like the old man, always waiting, always bending." Kenji, overhearing, spoke evenly. "Strength is not always in striking back. Sometimes it is in holding on until the storm passes." The debate ended there, but the tension lingered. Hiroshi felt it each time Masaru clenched his fists, each time Kenji quietly counseled patience. He stood between two worlds, one of fire, one of endurance. Illness soon swept through the camp, carried by foul water and exhaustion. Men coughed violently, their bodies weakened to the point of collapse. Hiroshi feared for his own life when fever struck him, his skin burning, his thoughts drifting into haze. He remembered lying in the dirt, convinced he might not rise again. Then a hand placed a rag soaked in cool water upon his forehead. Kenji's steady voice reached him. "Breathe, Takeda. You will not fall here." Hiroshi clung to those words, forcing himself through the sickness. When the fever broke, he lay staring at the sky, fragile yet alive. For the first time since capture, he understood that survival was not just endurance of the body, but also of the spirit, carried on by the will of others. As nights passed, Hiroshi began keeping silent promises to himself. He would not let despair consume him. He would learn the rhythms of the camp, adapt to its cruelties, and lean on those who stood beside him. Each day was a battle, but not against rifles or artillery. It was against hunger, fear, and the slow erosion of hope. In the quiet of one evening, as the camp settled into uneasy slumber, Hiroshi whispered words only he could hear. "I will live." The camp had settled into its cruel rhythm, yet within the fences, conflict brewed among the prisoners themselves. Hunger, exhaustion, and despair gnawed at their bodies, but pride and belief clashed harder than any physical suffering. For Hiroshi, the days grew heavier, not only because of the labor, but because of the tension rising between those who sought endurance and those who demanded resistance. It began one morning after roll call, when the prisoners were ordered to clear debris near the fence line. Masaru worked furiously, his face drenched in sweat, his jaw clenched tight. Suddenly he dropped his shovel, straightened his back, and said loud enough for others to hear, "This is not work for soldiers of the emperor. This is slavery." Several men lifted their heads, their eyes flickering with agreement. Hiroshi felt his stomach tighten. He knew the guards were watching closely, their rifles ready, but Masaru's words carried a dangerous energy. Kenji responded, his voice low but firm. "Hold your tongue. They will hear." "Let them hear," Masaru snapped. "Are we to live like dogs forever? Bushido teaches us death is better than shame. I will not bow any longer." Hiroshi stepped closer, whispering urgently, "Masaru, stop, you will bring punishment on all of us." But Masaru's face burned with fury. "And what has patience brought us? Empty stomachs, broken bodies, and the slow death of men who once called themselves warriors." The argument simmered until evening, when the prisoners gathered to rest. Masaru confronted Kenji directly, his voice sharp as steel. "You speak of endurance as though it were honor, but all I see is surrender disguised as wisdom." Kenji did not rise to anger. He looked at Masaru with steady eyes, his tone quiet but unyielding. "Wisdom is not surrender, it is survival. If you rush into fire, you burn. If you wait, perhaps you live long enough to see the fire fade." The circle of men around them listened in silence, the weight of the debate pressing heavily on every heart. Hiroshi felt torn, drawn to Masaru's fire, yet steadied by Kenji's calm. Each man represented a path, one of defiance that risked immediate destruction, and one of patience that risked the slow erosion of the soul. Days later, the tension reached a breaking point. Masaru made his attempt. During a work detail, he slipped toward the edge of the fence, testing its weaknesses, eyeing the guard's movements. Hiroshi saw him and his blood ran cold. He whispered harshly, "Don't do it. You'll doom us all." Masaru glared back, eyes blazing. "Better to die free than to rot in chains." Before Hiroshi could respond, a guard shouted, rifle raised. The camp erupted in noise, prisoners frozen in terror. Masaru was dragged back, beaten with fists and rifle butts until he collapsed. The punishment did not end with him. That evening, the entire group was denied food. Hiroshi lay on the ground, his stomach twisting with emptiness, his throat dry. Around him, men muttered bitterly, some blaming Masaru, others blaming the guards, still others blaming fate itself. Kenji's voice came quietly in the darkness. "This is what defiance brings. Suffering not only for one but for all." Masaru, bruised and bloodied, coughed weakly but did not retract his words. "At least I tried. At least I reminded them we are not broken." Hiroshi turned on his side, staring into the shadows. His heart ached with conflict. He could not dismiss Masaru's courage, yet he could not deny Kenji's truth. Both men embodied something Hiroshi felt within himself, the desperate desire to rise against his captors and the equally desperate need to survive another day. The camp was no longer only a prison of barbed wire and guards. It had become a battlefield of wills, where each man's choice threatened to shape not only his own fate, but the fate of everyone beside him. The weeks after Masaru's failed escape attempt left the camp tense and weary. Hunger still gnawed at bellies, but fear weighed heavier. Hiroshi kept his head low, following orders, conserving his strength. Yet despite his effort to disappear into routine, illness found him. A fever took hold, his body trembling under the thin blanket, his lips cracked from thirst. One afternoon, as he lay weak and unable to rise for roll call, footsteps approached. A guard shouted in English, his words sharp. Hiroshi could not understand, but the anger in the tone was clear. He braced for a blow. Instead, another voice interrupted, a Filipino medic attached to the camp. The young man crouched beside Hiroshi, his eyes quick with concern. He spoke gently, words Hiroshi did not know, but the tone carried reassurance. The medic pressed a damp cloth to Hiroshi's forehead, then gestured for water. A guard reluctantly handed over a canteen. Hiroshi drank, the coolness sliding down his throat like mercy itself. His vision blurred, but he saw the medic nod once as if to say, "Live." That night, Kenji leaned over him. "Even among enemies, there are those who see us as men, not monsters," he said quietly. Hiroshi absorbed the words, his mind foggy, yet moved. Days later, strength slowly returned to his body. While carrying water buckets under guard supervision, Hiroshi stumbled again, spilling part of the load. He winced, waiting for punishment. Instead, the American guard nearest him paused. The man was tall, with tired eyes and a jaw set like stone. He looked down at Hiroshi, muttered something under his breath, then gestured for him to refill the bucket. Hiroshi did not understand the words, but he understood the gesture. No strike, no punishment, only a weary command. That evening, he whispered to Kenji, "Why would they show restraint?" "I thought they hated us," Kenji answered. "Perhaps they do, but hatred does not always kill mercy. Remember that." A few days later, Hiroshi dared to test his broken English. While sweeping near a guard tower, he looked up at the same American soldier. Heart pounding, he spoke haltingly. "You name?" The guard stared at him, startled, then replied slowly, "Thomas." He pointed to himself. "Thomas," Hiroshi nodded, touching his chest. "Hiroshi." For a brief moment, neither was soldier nor prisoner, but simply two men acknowledging each other's humanity. The silence stretched, heavy but not hostile. Then Thomas gestured for him to keep sweeping. The brief connection ended but not forgotten. That night, Hiroshi replayed the moment in his mind. He had been raised to believe Americans were demons in human form, devoid of compassion. Yet Thomas's eyes had carried weariness, not cruelty, The realization unsettled him deeply. Later, as the men rested, Masaru scoffed at Hiroshi's story. "You think their small kindness changes what they are. Do not be fooled. They are our enemy. They will never see us as equals." Hiroshi did not argue, but Kenji placed a hand on his shoulder. "What matters is not what they see. What matters is that Hiroshi sees, and once you see, you cannot unsee." The camp remained a place of hardship, filled with hunger, disease, and despair. Yet within its harsh walls, Hiroshi began to notice small cracks where light entered. The medic's hand pressing cool water to his lips, the American guard's restraint, the exchange of names across the gulf of war. Each moment did not erase the suffering, but they planted something fragile within him, an idea that even in captivity, even in defeat, survival was not only about the body. It was about the threads of humanity that endured, stretched between men who should have hated each other, yet did not. The cold season came without mercy. Nights grew longer, and the thin blankets the prisoners were given offered little protection against the damp chill that seeped into their bones. Hunger worsened as supplies dwindled. Each morning the watery soup grew thinner, the handfuls of rice smaller. Men huddled together for warmth, coughing into the darkness, their bodies frail silhouettes of what they once had been. Hiroshi felt the weakness gnaw at him more with each passing day. His ribs showed beneath his skin, and his legs trembled whenever he lifted even the smallest load. He remembered his mother's cooking, the warmth of miso soup, the sound of her voice urging him to eat more. The memory stabbed at him cruelly, for now even the thought of such food felt like fantasy. Illness spread through the camp like wildfire. Dysentery claimed the strongest as easily as the weak. Men who once spoke with confidence now groaned in silence, curled on the ground. Hiroshi did what he could to help, carrying water, sharing scraps of his portion. But despair grew heavier as he watched life drain from those around him. One evening, his closest companion in the camp, a farmer's son named Daichi, collapsed and did not rise again. Hiroshi knelt beside him, shaking his shoulder, whispering his name. Daichi's eyes opened briefly, clouded with pain. "Tell them I fought," he murmured, though his hands trembled too weakly to grasp Hiroshi's. "I will," Hiroshi promised, voice breaking. But before dawn, Daichi was gone. His body was carried out silently, leaving only an empty space in the row of men. Hiroshi's chest felt hollow. He could not eat the thin ration placed before him that morning. He stared at it, then pushed it away. "What is the point?" he whispered. "One by one we vanish. Soon I will too." Kenji, ever watchful, sat beside him. His face was worn with lines of fatigue, but his eyes carried the same calm steadiness as always. "Do not give in to despair, Takeda. To live is still to fight." Hiroshi shook his head. "Fight for what? To starve more slowly? To die without meaning?" His voice cracked, louder than he intended. A guard shouted, and Hiroshi lowered his tone, trembling. "I envy Daichi. At least his suffering is over." Kenji's hand gripped his shoulder firmly. "No, do not speak like that. Death may seem merciful, but it robs you of every chance to see another sunrise. As long as you breathe, there is possibility." Masaru, overhearing, laughed bitterly. His face was still marked from his punishment weeks before. "Possibility? Look around you, Kenji. Men are dying like flies. Do you not see? Survival here is just waiting for your turn." Kenji did not answer Masaru directly. Instead, he looked at Hiroshi. "What you feel now is the weight of despair. It presses hard, harder than hunger, harder than cold. But if you bow to it, it will crush you. Resist it, Takeda. That is how you live." The words clung to Hiroshi even as grief and exhaustion pulled at him. That night, he lay awake, staring at the stars through the gaps in the wire. They seemed impossibly far, distant points of light that mocked the darkness of the camp. He thought of Daichi's final request, of his family in Osaka, of the simple act of breathing still left to him. When dawn came, he forced himself to rise, though his body screamed in protest. He ate his portion slowly, not because he hungered for it, but because refusing it would mean surrender. Each bite was bitter, yet each bite was defiance against despair. The camp was a graveyard of fading lives, but Hiroshi told himself he would not join them. Not yet. Somewhere inside him, faint as the stars above, a flicker of will remained. The days after Daiichi's death were heavy, yet something within Hiroshi shifted. He rose each morning with a dull ache in his chest, but instead of surrendering to despair, he clung to Kenji's words. Resist it. The camp was still a place of suffering, but within its misery, Hiroshi began to notice the quiet ways men helped each other endure. One afternoon, during the meager distribution of rations, an older prisoner stumbled, spilling half his portion onto the dirt. For a moment, no one moved. The instinct to protect food was too strong. But then a soldier named Haruto bent down, scooping part of his own rice into the man's bowl. "Eat," Haruto said. "Tomorrow you can share with me." The gesture spread like a spark. Others began to offer scraps when they could, bits of clothing, even whispered words of encouragement. Kenji leaned toward Hiroshi that evening. "Do you see? Even in this place, kindness can grow. We are not animals. As long as we remember that, we still live as men." Hiroshi nodded slowly. The memory of Daiichi's lifeless body still haunted him, but the sight of prisoners helping each other kindled something fragile in his chest. For the first time in weeks, he felt not only the weight of loss but also the faint stirrings of hope. He began to keep a hidden diary, scratching words onto scraps of paper torn from discarded packaging. Using a stub of charcoal from the cooking fires, he recorded thoughts, memories, and fragments of the days. He wrote of Osaka, the bustling markets, the smell of grilled fish, his sister's laughter. He wrote of Daiichi, promising that his name would not vanish in silence. And he wrote of survival, reminding himself each night why he had to wake the next morning. One evening, Masaru noticed him writing. "What is that?" he asked sharply. Hiroshi froze, clutching the paper close. "Nothing." Masaru's eyes narrowed. "You risk your life for scribbles?" Kenji intervened, his voice calm. "Let him be. Words can feed the spirit as much as food feeds the body." Masaru scoffed but said no more. Hiroshi kept writing, his heart steadying with each mark of charcoal. The diary became his secret anchor, a place where despair could be transformed into memory, where silence gave way to meaning. Days bled into weeks, but the small acts of solidarity continued. When Hiroshi fell ill again, another prisoner offered him part of his ration without a word. When Haruto injured his hand during labor, Hiroshi wrapped it with a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. These moments stitched bonds between men who had once been strangers, now united by the will to endure. One night, as the camp quieted, Hiroshi whispered to Kenji, "I did not think hope could survive here." Kenji smiled faintly, though his eyes carried sadness. "Hope does not vanish. It hides, waiting for us to notice. Sometimes it is in the smallest things, a word, a gesture, a memory." Hiroshi thought of the medic who had pressed water to his lips, of the guard who had spared him punishment, of the rice shared in silence. These were not victories, but they were proofs that life, however fragile, still reached for light. As he lay on the cold ground, Hiroshi clutched his hidden diary close to his chest. The barbed wire still surrounded him, the guards still watched with suspicion, and hunger still carved at his bones. But within him, a seed had been planted. He would not let it die. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would rise again. And the day after. And as long as he could breathe, he would carry the memory of those beside him. Survival was no longer only his own. It was for all who had fallen and for those who still endured. Tension in the camp reached a breaking point one sweltering afternoon. The sun scorched overhead as prisoners lined up for inspection. The guards shouted orders in English, their voices sharp and impatient. Many Japanese soldiers struggled to understand, and hesitation brought swift punishment. Hiroshi felt sweat sting his eyes as he tried to mimic the gestures, moving where told. But behind him confusion spread. A guard barked again, louder this time. Masaru muttered under his breath, refusing to move. "They treat us like animals. They think we have no pride." His words carried anger that several nearby prisoners echoed with nods. The guard grew frustrated, motioning aggressively. When the men did not respond quickly enough, he shoved one of them hard. The prisoner stumbled, falling to the dirt. Gasps rose among the Japanese. Instinctively, 2 men stepped forward to help him, but the guard raised his rifle threateningly. Hiroshi's heart pounded. He understood both sides. The guards saw disobedience, but the prisoners saw dishonor in being treated so roughly. He stepped forward cautiously, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. Using the few words of English he knew, he said, "Wait. Mistake. No understand." The guard's eyes narrowed. "Back. Now." Hiroshi swallowed hard, searching for the right words. He pointed at the fallen man, then at himself, then mimed lifting. "Help. Only help." His voice shook, but his eyes stayed steady. For a tense moment, silence pressed down like a storm about to break. Finally, the guard gave a sharp gesture, allowing Hiroshi and another prisoner to lift the man. Relief flooded Hiroshi's chest, though he knew the tension was far from over. That night, the camp buzzed with whispers. Some praised Hiroshi for preventing worse violence. Others, Masaru most of all, saw his act as weakness. "You begged like a dog," Masaru spat, his voice low but venomous. "They do not respect us. They will only step harder when you kneel." Hiroshi's jaw tightened. "If I had not spoken, there would have been blood. Is that what you wanted? For more of us to be beaten, or worse?" Masaru's fists clenched. "Better beaten than humiliated. We were soldiers of the Emperor." "You forget that," Kenji interjected calmly, though his voice carried weight. "And what honor is left in dead men, Masaru? Hiroshi did what was necessary. He saw beyond pride and prevented destruction." Masaru turned away, muttering curses under his breath. The divide among the prisoners grew deeper, each man struggling to balance the Bushido code drilled into them since youth with the brutal demands of captivity. Hiroshi lay awake later, staring at the faint glow of the guard towers. He questioned himself. Had he shown courage by stepping forward, or had he betrayed the dignity of his comrades? His stomach churned with doubt. But then he remembered the guard's hesitation, the moment when anger could have turned to bloodshed, but did not. That hesitation had been bought with words, not weapons. The following day, as prisoners worked under supervision, Hiroshi noticed the same guard, Thomas, watching him closely. Their eyes met briefly. Thomas said nothing, but there was no malice in his gaze, only weariness. Hiroshi looked away quickly, yet the silent acknowledgement lingered. Later, Kenji spoke quietly as they hauled stones. "Bridges are not built in a day. Even a single plank laid across water can carry weight. What you did was lay a plank, Hiroshi. Do not doubt it." The words steadied him. He realized survival in the camp was not only about enduring hunger and illness, but also about navigating the invisible battlefield of culture, honor, and misunderstanding. Every choice carried risk, not just of punishment, but of dividing the fragile unity among the prisoners themselves. For Hiroshi, that day marked a revelation. Sometimes to preserve dignity, one had to bend without breaking. And though Masaru's scorn still burned in his ears, Hiroshi felt a quiet conviction that his path, however uncertain, was the one that might keep them alive. Rumors crept into the camp like whispers carried on the wind. At first, they were vague, talk of islands falling, of battles lost. Then one evening, a Filipino worker whispered to a prisoner in broken Japanese, "Japan and losing." The words spread quickly, passed from man to man, until the camp buzzed with tension. Hiroshi listened, his chest tightening. He had been raised to believe in the Empire's invincibility, taught that surrender was unthinkable, because Japan could not fall. Now the certainty cracked. Could it be true? Could the land of his birth, the nation for which he had fought and nearly died, be losing the war? That night, as the prisoners huddled together, Masaru's voice rose in anger. "Lies. That is what they want us to believe. Do you not see? They try to break our spirit. Japan will never surrender. The Emperor will never bow." Some nodded fiercely, clinging to his fire as though it were a lifeline. But others lowered their heads, doubt flickering in their tired eyes. Hiroshi sat in silence, torn. Kenji spoke quietly, his tone steady but somber. It may be true. If the tide of war has turned, then the world we knew is already gone. We must prepare for what comes. Masaru glared at him. You speak like a man who has abandoned his country. Kenji met his stare calmly. No. I speak like a man who has accepted truth. Clinging to illusion will not bring Japan victory, nor will it keep us alive. The argument cut through the silence of the camp. Hiroshi felt the weight of both voices pressing against him. Masaru's defiance stirred something proud and familiar, the echo of the training drilled into him. But Kenji's words struck deeper, rooted in the harsh reality around them. He thought of Daiichi, of the men who had already died. What had pride given them but early graves? Days passed, and more whispers reached the prisoners. Tales of American bombers striking Japanese cities, of soldiers retreating, of hopeless battles fought and lost. Each rumor sharpened the divide among the prisoners. Some clung desperately to the dream of ultimate victory. Others began to accept that defeat loomed. One evening, Hiroshi sat with Kenji as the sky darkened. If it is true, Hiroshi said quietly, if Japan loses, what does that mean for us? Kenji's eyes softened. It means survival becomes even more important. If we return, it will not be to the same land we left. It will be to something new, perhaps broken, and we must be strong enough to face it. Hiroshi looked at the ground, his throat dry. I don't know if I am strong enough. Kenji placed a hand on his shoulder. Strength is not about never doubting. It is about rising even when doubt weighs you down. Remember that. Across the camp, Masaru was still stirring resistance. He whispered to those who would listen, urging them to hold faith that Japan would rise again, that liberation was near. Do not listen to cowards, he told them. Our comrades are coming. You will see. We will be free by the sword, not by waiting like beaten dogs. His words drew nods from the desperate, those who needed to believe salvation was imminent. Hiroshi watched from a distance, his heart torn once more. That night, lying beneath the thin blanket, Hiroshi thought of Osaka, of his mother, his sister, his father. If the rumors were true, what had become of them? Were bombs falling near his home? Were they alive or gone as so many others? His chest ached with helplessness. The camp was no longer only a prison of barbed wire. It had become a mirror of the larger war, reflecting the collapse of certainty, the fracture between pride and survival. And for Hiroshi, each whisper of defeat carved deeper into his soul, forcing him to question not only his future, but the very meaning of the life he still clung to. Winter loosened its grip, and though the prisoners were still gaunt and weary, small changes began to ripple through camp life. One morning, instead of the usual harsh orders, the guards allowed a group of men to gather beneath a tree. A battered harmonica played a hesitant tune, and for a brief hour the prisoners were permitted to sing. The sound startled Hiroshi at first. The voices were low and cracked, but they carried echoes of home, folk songs once sung in villages, lullabies mothers whispered to children. Hiroshi's throat tightened. He joined in softly, his voice rusty, until the melody lifted him beyond the barbed wire. When the song ended, silence hung heavy, but it was not the silence of despair. It was the silence of men who had remembered they were more than prisoners. Later that week, an unusual sight occurred. One of the guards, Thomas, the American Hiroshi had spoken to briefly before, approached the prisoners during labor. He watched them struggle with heavy logs, then suddenly bent down and helped lift one himself. The act drew stares from both guards and prisoners. Though he said nothing, the message was unmistakable. He did not see them solely as enemies. That evening, Hiroshi told Kenji, his voice filled with wonder, "Why would he help? He gains nothing." Kenji smiled faintly. Compassion often asks for nothing in return. Remember, Takeda, even the enemy carries burdens. Sometimes they too seek to lighten them, if only for a moment. Hiroshi nodded, though part of him still wrestled with the thought. Could a man who had sworn to destroy Japan also carry kindness in his heart? One afternoon, while sweeping near the fence, Hiroshi noticed Thomas again. Gathering courage, he repeated the word he had learned before. Thomas, he pointed to himself. Hiroshi. Thomas studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Hiroshi, he repeated, the name foreign on his tongue but spoken without malice. The sound struck Hiroshi like a spark. His name, his identity, had not been erased, it had been acknowledged. That night, as he lay on the hard ground, Hiroshi whispered the exchange to Kenji. Kenji listened, then said, "A name spoken is a bridge built." Do not underestimate its strength. Not all guards showed such humanity. Some remained harsh, striking men for hesitation, treating them as less than human. Yet the memory of that small recognition, of being called by name rather than number, lingered with Hiroshi. It gave him a strange sense of dignity he had not felt in months. The spirit of fragile humanity spread in other ways. A group of prisoners began to carve simple toys from scraps of wood, tiny animals, a flute, a small board game. They shared them in the evenings, passing moments of distraction among the weary. Hiroshi smiled for the first time in what felt like forever when one of the men handed him a carved bird. The figure was rough, its wings uneven, but it carried the memory of freedom. Masaru scoffed when he saw it. "You waste your strength on childish things." Hiroshi met his eyes calmly. "It reminds me that we are still men, not shadows." For once, Masaru did not answer. As the days passed, Hiroshi noticed how even the smallest gestures carried power. A guard turning a blind eye when a prisoner rested a moment longer, a prisoner sharing a song, a name spoken across the gulf of language. Each act was fragile, fleeting, but together they formed a thread that bound life to life, refusing to let despair consume everything. Lying beneath the stars one evening, Hiroshi whispered to himself, "Even here there is still humanity." The thought did not erase the hunger or the fear, but it steadied his spirit like a candle flickering against the dark. Hunger had always stalked the camp, but now it became a merciless predator. Rations shrank to almost nothing, thin broth that carried no strength, grains of rice that barely filled the palm. The men grew gaunt, their faces hollow, their eyes sunken, bones jutted beneath stretched skin. Every movement felt heavier, every breath a labor. Whispers of discontent grew louder. One evening, as men sat clutching their empty bowls, Masaru's voice cut through the silence. "They are starving us on purpose. Do you not see? They want us weak so we cannot resist, and we sit here waiting like cattle." Hiroshi felt his stomach cramp, twisting in pain. He knew Masaru spoke what many felt, but dared not say. Kenji, seated beside him, answered with weary calm, "We must endure. If we riot, they will kill us all." But Masaru's fury was like dry tinder. Then better to die fighting than to die crawling. The next day the breaking point came. During the ration line, when a guard set down a pot of watery soup, a prisoner, his face desperate, his frame skeletal, lunged forward, grabbing more than his share. The guards shouted, shoving him back. In an instant others surged forward, bowls thrust out, voices rising. Hiroshi was caught in the chaos, pushed by the tide of bodies. He heard the crack of rifle butts striking, the desperate cries of men who had lost all restraint. The guards roared orders in English, but the frenzy only grew. It was no longer about food alone. It was about dignity, about survival clawed from the edge of despair. A shot fired into the air silenced the crowd. The prisoners froze, breathless, their eyes wide with fear. A guard pointed his rifle at the trembling man who had started it all. Hiroshi's heart stopped. He thought the man would be executed then and there, but instead the guards beat him brutally, leaving him broken in the dirt. As punishment, rations were withheld entirely that evening. Hiroshi lay on the ground, his stomach a hollow void, his body trembling with weakness. Around him men cursed in whispers, their voices edged with bitterness. Masaru spoke with venom. "Do you see? They do not see us as men, only as beasts to be controlled. And still you talk of patience, Kenji?" Kenji's voice was quiet, but firm. "If you let anger rule you, it will consume us all. You think defiance brings strength, but it brings only graves." Masaru spat, his eyes blazing. At least a grave is ours. At least it means we chose. Hiroshi listened, his chest tight. He felt torn between the two men once more, caught between fire and endurance. His body screamed for food, his mind screamed for escape. But something deeper within him whispered that surrendering to rage would mean losing the fragile humanity they had fought to hold on to. That night, as the camp lay in uneasy silence, Hiroshi nearly gave up. His head swam with hunger, his limbs refused to move, and he thought of letting himself fade into nothing. But then Kenji's hand rested on his shoulder. "Do not give in, Takeda. Do not let despair take you. You must outlast this. Promise me." Hiroshi whispered, barely audible. "Why? For what?" Kenji's voice was steady. "For tomorrow. For the chance to see what comes. If you fall now, you will never know if there was meaning in surviving." The words pierced Hiroshi's fog. He clung to them as though they were bread, as though they were water. In that moment he realized survival was not only about the body, it was about choosing, again and again, not to let despair consume the last flicker of will. The camp was breaking, men collapsing under the weight of hunger and rage, yet Hiroshi swore to himself that he would not be one of them, not yet. The air in the camp shifted before anyone spoke of it aloud. Guards moved differently, tense, restless, their eyes scanning the horizon more often than the prisoners. Rumors seeped in through scraps of overheard conversation, through whispers from Filipino laborers who carried news like contraband. The Allies were advancing. The war outside the wire was turning. Hiroshi felt the tension in every breath. Each sunrise carried a question. Would today bring freedom or death? The fear was not only of the guards, but of their own countrymen. The prisoners whispered that if Japanese forces retreated, they might order executions to erase the shame of captivity. The thought pressed like ice against Hiroshi's heart. One night, lying awake beneath the pale stars, he turned to Kenji. "If the Americans win, will they free us? Or kill us first?" Kenji's face was calm but grave. "No man here can answer that. But I believe the world beyond these fences has already changed. The war is no longer ours to fight. All we can do is endure long enough to see what comes." Masaru, listening nearby, let out a bitter laugh. "How trust the Americans? Fools. When they are done with us, they will bury us. Do not mistake their silence for mercy." Hiroshi felt torn, as always, between Kenji's steady pragmatism and Masaru's consuming fire. His own chest tightened with doubt. Hope flickered, but so did dread. Days passed with strange signs. Guards no longer barked orders with the same authority. Supplies grew irregular, as if the chains that held the camp together were loosening. Prisoners noticed the guards whispering among themselves, their rifles clutched tighter, their tempers short. One afternoon, while hauling water, Hiroshi heard distant thunder, not from the sky but from artillery. The ground seemed to tremble faintly beneath his feet. Other prisoners noticed it too, their faces lighting with a dangerous mixture of fear and hope. That evening, as they huddled together, Haruto spoke what many dared not. "The front is close, perhaps within days." Masaru's eyes gleamed. "Then we must be ready. If they try to kill us, we strike first." Kenji shook his head. "Recklessness now is death. We have waited this long, we must wait a little longer." Hiroshi remained silent, though his mind raced. He thought of his family in Osaka, of whether they still lived, of what kind of Japan he might return to, if he survived. He thought of Daiichi's last words, of the fragile diary hidden in his shirt, of every moment of kindness that had kept him alive. And he wondered if liberation would feel like salvation, or like another kind of loss. One evening, as the camp grew still, Hiroshi caught sight of Thomas, the American guard who had once spoken his name. Their eyes met through the dim light. For the first time, Hiroshi saw fear in the guard's face, not hatred, not cruelty, but fear. It struck him that the guards, too, were uncertain of their fate. The war did not belong only to captives or captors. It swallowed everyone. Later, Kenji whispered, "Do you feel it, Takeda? The end is near." "" 'But endings are never gentle.'" Hiroshi closed his eyes, locked his hands. "We must wait a little longer." Kenji whispered, "Do you feel it, Takeda? The end is near." "But endings are never gentle." Hiroshi closed his eyes, locked his hands. the sounds of distant gunfire echoing in his ears. He could almost taste freedom, sharp and strange like metal on his tongue. Yet with it came the weight of dread, that liberation might not come in time, that the final days might demand a price too heavy to bear. Still, he told himself, he would rise again tomorrow. He would endure one more day and another, until the gates opened or his body failed him, because somewhere beyond the wire the world was moving, and with it the fragile promise of survival. The morning began like any other, with the sharp blast of a whistle and the groan of weary men pulling themselves to their feet. But there was something different in the air, an unease, a tension that hummed through the camp like a taut string ready to snap. Guards barked fewer orders. Their eyes darted toward the horizon, and their rifles hung loose at their sides. Hiroshi felt it in his chest. Something was about to change. By midday, the distant rumble of artillery was no longer faint. It roared like thunder, rolling closer with every hour. The ground trembled beneath bare feet, and prisoners exchanged wary glances. Some whispered prayers, others clenched their fists as if readying for a final stand. Hiroshi's stomach twisted, not with hunger this time, but with anticipation so sharp it bordered on fear. Masaru's eyes burned with fierce light. "Do you hear it? Our comrades come for us. The Empire rises again." Kenji shook his head, voice calm but edged with sorrow. "No, that is not the sound of Japan's triumph. That is the sound of its fall." The debate was cut short by chaos at the gates. Shouts in English rang out as guards scrambled, some rushing to secure positions, others abandoning their posts. The prisoners pressed closer to the wire, straining to see. Hiroshi's pulse pounded in his ears. Then, through the haze of dust and heat, he saw them. Allied soldiers advancing with determination, rifles raised. Gunfire erupted. Prisoners dropped to the ground instinctively as bullets cracked through the air. Hiroshi pressed his face to the dirt, heart hammering. The battle for the camp had begun. For endless minutes, the world became a blur of shouting, smoke, and the deafening roar of gunfire. And then silence. Slowly, Hiroshi lifted his head. The guards were gone. Some fled, some dead. The gates, once a wall between captivity and freedom, now swung open. For a long moment, no one moved. The prisoners stared, disbelieving, too numb to accept what their eyes told them. It was Haruto who stood first, his voice hoarse. "It's over." Hiroshi rose unsteadily, legs trembling, vision swimming. He walked toward the open gates, each step heavier than the last. When he crossed the threshold, his knees nearly gave way. The open world stretched before him, vast and terrifying in its freedom. Tears blurred his eyes. He thought of Daichi, of all the men who had not lived to see this day. He whispered their names under his breath, as if carrying them with him through the gates. Beside him, Kenji placed a steady hand on his shoulder. His voice, though quiet, carried deep weight. "We are free, Takeda. But remember, freedom is heavier than chains." Masaru stumbled forward too, his face a storm of triumph and grief. "I told you," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. His eyes darted across the empty guard towers, the fallen bodies, the strange soldiers, who now looked at them not as enemies but as survivors. All around, men wept openly, some falling to their knees, others lifting their arms to the sky. For Hiroshi, the moment was overwhelming. He wanted to shout, to laugh, to collapse into the earth. Instead, he stood still, breathing the air beyond the barbed wire for the first time in years. It tasted of dust, of smoke, of change, and of life. He knew this freedom carried with it questions he could not yet answer. What awaited him in Japan, whether his family still lived, whether the man who returned home would even resemble the soldier who had left. But for now, none of that mattered. For now, he had stepped through the gates, and with that step, captivity ended. The return to Japan was nothing like Hiroshi had once imagined. The war was over, but victory had not awaited him, only silence, ruin, and the hollow weight of survival. When he stepped onto the docks of Osaka, his homeland was almost unrecognizable. Buildings lay in rubble, smoke lingered in the air, and the once bustling streets moved with quiet footsteps instead of proud marching. Hiroshi's heart raced as he approached his family's home, unsure if anyone would still be there. His hands trembled as he pushed open the worn wooden door. Inside, his mother gasped, her frail frame trembling as tears filled her eyes. She rushed forward, wrapping her arms around him as though to make sure he was real. His sister clung to him too, sobbing into his torn uniform. "You came back," his mother whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought I never would," Hiroshi replied, his throat tight. His father stood in the doorway, older and more fragile than Hiroshi remembered. His stern gaze softened, though his words were few. "You survived." That single statement carried both relief and unspoken weight. Hiroshi lowered his head, ashamed. "I lived in captivity. I brought dishonor," but his father shook his head. "No, you carried life back with you. That is no dishonor." The words struck Hiroshi harder than any blow. For months, years even, he had feared being seen as a failure, as a son who had disgraced his name. Now to hear his father's voice accept him, it was like breathing fresh air after years underground. Still, peace did not come easily. Night after night, Hiroshi woke in sweat, the echoes of the camp still clawing at his mind. He remembered Daiichi's final breath, Masaru's fire, Kenji's steady voice. He remembered hunger that gnawed like an endless beast, the cold that bit through bone, and the barbed wire that once hemmed in his world. But he also remembered something else, the quiet acts of humanity that had saved him. The medic's cool rag against his forehead, the American guard who spoke his name, Kenji's wisdom, Masaru's stubborn fire, the voices that sang under a tree when despair seemed unbreakable. These were the threads that had kept him alive. Years later, when Hiroshi was asked about his time as a prisoner, he did not speak of shame. He spoke of endurance. Of what it meant to be human even when stripped of dignity, of the choice to keep breathing when everything urged surrender. His voice carried the weight of memory, but also the light of survival. He kept the small diary he had written in the camp, its pages smudged with sweat and charcoal. Whenever he opened it, he traced the names of those who had not returned. "You are not forgotten," he whispered, keeping his promise to Daiichi and to all the others who had vanished in silence. Kenji lived long enough to return home as well, though weakened by illness. Masaru, fierce to the end, had not survived the final weeks of captivity. Hiroshi carried them both in his heart, two opposite forces whose presence had shaped his own path. Standing once more in Osaka's streets, Hiroshi realized that survival was not only for himself, it was for them too, for every man who could not tell his story. And so, he spoke, he remembered, he endured. His voice, like his life, became a testament that even in captivity hope could survive. Even when death seemed certain, men could rise again. And now, if you want to keep uncovering untold stories of resilience, subscribe to the channel. Your support allows these voices to live on. And don't stop here. Click the suggested video now on your screen to continue this journey into history's hidden truths.